why do you think the scriptwriters maybe made that decision to bring her back alive and keep consistent with the other two films and bringing the murderers back as well?
You know, again, this kind of goes to the heart of the impetus, the character arc of the parents.
Yeah.
I suppose and again, this could be an issue of cultural context. I can say that definitely in the 2009 film, part of the impetus, if you will, what you're supposed to believe is that they're trying to protect their daughter. She's still alive. They still have her. They need to get her from this home with the psychotic, band of wanderers. And protect her life. So maybe the writers were just struggling with a sense of, well, what is believable in terms of the revenge fantasy? But it definitely alters, by her being alive, it complicates the issue of the revenge fantasy.
It does, and in these kind of rape revenge films, which is a subgenre that it's definitely not to everyone's taste, but it's legitimate subgenre of films. Sometimes the dramatic stakes are higher if it's the victim herself or himself doing the vengeance, because it's like, on some level we can justify it to ourselves as an audience if they're taking it into their own hands. But it's a different thing if it's someone doing it on their behalf.
Right.
And I guess, and I might be wrong, but in the 2009 version, there seems to be a sense that they want to catch the audience up in that excitement of there being a final girl who may or may not survive, which is of course something that we've all learned happens in horror films.
Yes.
And maybe it's like, well, that's an extra investment they're making in keeping the audience there, to bring the daughter home alive and see if she will indeed make it through these horrible things she's been through. But the violence in the film, I think, is different from the violence in the 72 version, because the 72 version is very at odds with itself. I know you said you haven't seen it, but the tone changes so frequently in that film that in a way I would say it's a less coherent film than the remake, which I almost would never say about a remake and an original. But it's almost as if Wes Craven thinks he's showing you something of great brutality, but then he feels like he needs to give you an escape hatch. Right. So he'll cut to these comedic scenes of these bumbling police officers, and it becomes a Keystone Cops routine. And there's this weird folk music that was composed specifically for the film that narrates the action in song.
Oh.
So it's completely bizarre, and you can't imagine that in the remake. The remake would never do something like that.
The remake is definitely very terse. It's very focused on getting to the next step in the narrative.
Yeah. So maybe the remake has a more solid sense of plot, sense of keeping the action moving, whereas the original was episodic in several directions. It's following the storyline of these cops and laughing at them, but then how can you genuinely get into the humor of a scene like that when it's juxtaposed with the horror of a scene like The Attack? So, I don't know. I don't know if I would say that one is better formally as a film and the other is better as a cultural artifact or a historical artifact. I know that the original did find embrace with the art house community. And it is such a trashy film that you wonder what kind of rationalizations people were making.
Right.
Did they go in there and say, well, I heard Wes Craven say this is about Vietnam, so I'm going to try to watch it that way and be high-minded about it.
Right.
When in reality, it's a significantly more trashy film than even the remake.
Not a political statement.
Yeah, and I mean, again, like I said, you could say this is a film that documents the end of a dream of the utopian commune, summer of love kind of thing. But you had films like Easy Rider and Gimme Shelter that already did that, and they did it better. And it didn't need to be done again in the early 70s. So yeah, that's what I would have to say about the political subtext.
Well, for me, one of the other, or the other theme kind of going on in this film that is to a degree a subgenre as well, is the idea of, the family unit, the ideal family unit being corrupted, complicated, challenged by an external force. And at the conclusion of the Last House on the Left, 2009, I immediately thought of Cape Fear. In terms of, kind of the more wholesome, idealistic family unit being terrorized, stalked, if you will, by, in this particular instance, one assailant as opposed to a group. So in terms of this genre, if you want to see a film that makes a more complicated observation about the nature of humanity and the nature of violence, I would recommend the 1991 Cape Fear with Robert De Niro over Last House on the Left, and even more importantly, I would actually recommend the 1962 version, the original with Gregory Peck and Robert Mitchum, as an even more nuanced and complicated argument about the nature of violence and even civilization. What is civilized punishment?
Yeah, and I think that's a good point you make about the families, because one thing that I think all versions of this Virgin Spring Last House on the Left story do is not only do they have a family that is a wholesome family, whatever you take that to mean, attacked by an outside force, but it's attacked by an outside force that is an unwholesome family.
Right.
It's a family unit that is unholy in the universe of these films. So you have a wholesome family and then an unholy family, and I think the conflict between those two is arguably a dramatically interesting thing. Now, again, I don't know if that's saying that, I don't know if the films are trying to suggest that alternative family units are evil. I mean, one could say that the films are particularly conservative in that respect. That they're saying, you know, divorce creates this kind of a situation, or, you know, an illegitimate, whatever criticisms people could make about these monster families that appear in these films. But you do see that. So you have an alternative, horrific family unit in Last House on the Left. Same kind of thing in other things that Craven has been associated with. The Hills Have Eyes has a similar good family confronted by a mutant collection of people. And so, I mean, it would be interesting to see a horror film take a kinder eye toward the mutant family.
Right.
There probably have been films that did that. I don't know if I could think of any that come to mind right now. I think probably some films that are sympathetic towards alien forces, that paint them as misunderstood, do this kind of thing. But it is interesting how these families reinforce traditional idea of what makes a family stick together. And that's arguably an okay thing. I mean, you know, it's not necessarily tied to politics. I think probably the mainstream audience wants to see the girl return home. The mainstream audience wants to see mom and dad stay together. And so there's nothing necessarily wrong with it. It's just interesting that, that we quickly turn the other family into the grotesque figure in the plot. I wonder what the source of that is.
So I guess your final judgment, Tommy, when it comes to the 2009 remake of Last House on the Left, watch this or don't watch this?
Of the remake?
Of the remake.
Watch this if you're interested in modern horror films. And especially if you've seen one or both of the other films with this storyline. Because I think it's interesting to see how the times can change how the same plot works, or how the film ratings board can change the way a certain film plays out. I think that Last House on the Left 2009 is worthy for those reasons. It's not so much worthy for the way the camera seems to enjoy the violence.
And for that very reason, I think I'm going to have to say don't watch this, but I'm going to offer the caveat that I am not a major horror film fan. And again, to me, this film has been classified as horror, but for me, it does not fit into that traditional genre. I'm not saying it's the worst film I've ever seen by any stretch, but I am definitely not recommending that, you know, folks put it on their must-see list.
It's definitely not a must-see, but I think it has value for the reasons that we discussed. But beware of that final shot, as you said earlier.
Yeah,
because
it's a rough one.
And even in the R-rated version, it's the same thing. And it's easily the most intense single shot in the film.
Yes.
The attack scene of the assailants and the daughter is a more intense sequence or scene. But in terms of the most intense shot, it's got to be that final shot.
Yeah,
so if you feel that the film is at its end, and it does telegraph, you pretty much know you're there, I would say look away.
Yes, exactly. Well,